We've got a double jump in this episode as we look at Activision's July 1980 release Checkers and Atari's own September 1980 rendition Video Checkers. This video is a slight break of the format we've all grown accustomed to, but for good reason. By sheer coincidence, Activision and Atari both published VCS versions of the board game Checkers mere months apart, and for our chronology, they happened to land pretty much right next to each other. Rather than going over much of the same background on the history of checkers, or drafts as it's known in British English, in the computing space, it made more sense to talk about their histories together. It's an approach I may take to a greater degree in a few years when we start getting into the software glut of 1982 and 1983, but for now, consider this a special test case. Checkers, like chess, backgammon, and bulls and cows, is an ancient game with origins dating back to Mesopotamia and Egypt, and numerous variations of the game exist today throughout the globe. The modern rule set seen in both of these VCS renditions dates back to 1500s France, and is generally known as either English drafts or American checkers, depending on where you're at. Under this rule set, pieces can only move forward diagonally, and if it's possible for a piece to jump at opposing players, they must do so, even if it puts them in a bad position. If it's possible to jump a piece and then immediately take another piece, then that must also be done. This is key to the strategy of checkers under these rules, forcing your opponent to take your pieces and put themselves in a position to get jumped, possibly more than one time. Once a piece reaches the far side of the board, they are kinged and can move forwards and backwards on diagonals. The game ends when one side runs out of pieces, or if there's a draw. This is certainly the rule set seen most commonly in the history of computing. Checkers was among the earliest computer games ever written, with British computer scientist Christopher Strachey producing a working, complete draughts program on the Ferranti Mark I computer at the University of Manchester in July 1952. Strachey had an initial but non-functional version in May 1951, but continued working on it over the next year thanks to encouragement from famed computer scientist Alan Turing. Strachey gave a talk about the program in Toronto later that year, which in turn inspired American AI specialist Arthur Samuel to develop his own checkers program at IBM. An initial version was completed in 1952, but Samuel continued to refine it over the following years, gaining notoriety when it was demonstrated running on an IBM 701 on national TV in 1956. Both Strachey and Samuel's games were written as early experiments into artificial intelligence, with the player going up against a computer opponent, and checkers, like chess, would serve as a barometer for how powerful a computer, and the programming behind it, could be. A version of the board game for DEC's PDP computers was written by Paul Klinkman in 1971, and a basic rendition appeared in the pages of David Dahl's 101 Basic Computer Games in 1973. On home consoles, Checkers as a game had a rough start. Checkers games were advertised in 1978 and 1979 for the Fairchild Channel F and Bally Professional Arcade, respectively, but neither of these renditions would see the light of day for some time. The earliest console take on the game would be a checkers program, initially written by John Collins for the Bally Arcade in BASIC, back in May 1979, and sold on cassette tape the following month, with refinements by other developers over the next couple years. This didn't use the controller, but rather had players typing in their moves using the console's keypad using X and Y coordinates. It's awkward, and will crash completely if you type in coordinates outside of its range, but the game itself plays pretty well, with the computer having a predetermined amount of time to consider its moves. Bally's own checkers game would go unreleased until 1985, when enthusiast Mike White got a hold of the prototype cartridge and sold copies of it through the Arcadian newsletter. While this is playable, the computer puts up such a poor fight that it's entirely likely that the game AI was never refined. Fairchild's Checkers game was completed and even promoted prior to the company liquidating its video game division to Zircon, and in August 1980 the company issued a press release announcing that it, alongside 3 other unreleased Channel F games, would now be available for purchase through its product catalog. The Channel F Checkers program is a worthy opponent to this pretty inexperienced player, but arguably the most notable legacy this game has is as the rarest and most expensive commercial Channel F release, as unlike the other late-release titles, it appears Checkers was not a strong enough seller to justify Zircon doing any other production runs beyond the initial one, and it's likely that even this was just leftover Fairchild stock. The Channel F and the VCS weren't the only platforms hosting checkers in 1980, though, as Mattel released checkers alongside the Intellivision platform in March as the company continued its slow rollout across North America for the game system. With 2 computer skill levels and an interesting feature where you can ask the computer to recommend you a move, which in practice seems to be a suggestion to move into harm's way, it's a pretty solid version with the usual Intellivision audio-visual flair. The game would be included in INTV's Triple Challenge Cart alongside chess and backgammon in 1987, which, much like Zircon's checkers game, is something of a coveted and rare collectible today. Which brings us to our pair of VCS checkers releases. According to an interview with Al Bakil, Alan Miller's Activision released version originally started off as a 3D game that would use red-blue glasses to reduce its effect. This didn't work out for 2 reasons. For one, the limitations of the VCS's horizontal display meant that there wasn't much room to get the appropriate offset for the stereoscopic display. And 2, given that color TVs weren't precisely machine calibrated until microprocessors like RCA's 1802 came along in the mid-70s to do that work, there were a lot of color sets in homes at the time that weren't reproducing the colors accurately enough for the glasses to work. Miller would drop the 3D and simply focus on finishing the rest of the game. On a technical note, Miller's checkers game is the first one of these strategic board games to maintain vertical blanking while the computer is thinking, meaning that it doesn't wreak havoc on my capture setup. So kudos to Miller for this specific scenario. Meanwhile at Atari, Carol Shaw had started work on video checkers at about the same time in 1979. In an interview with Ben Jedswords, Shaw said that she had no idea Miller was doing his own version at the time, but learned after the fact that both of them had been consulting with Arthur Samuel on their respective games, and he simply didn't inform either of them about it. Their games both feature distinctive graphical styles, with Miller's maintaining the pseudo-3D he envisioned to begin with, and Shaw going with an overhead display. Alan Miller's game is certainly a leaner package than Carol Shaw's, in large part because it's a 2 kilobyte game compared to her 4 kilobyte cartridge. His cartridge gives you 3 difficulty levels to work with, as well as a 2-player mode in case you don't have a board handy. The right difficulty switch allows the player to swap the red and white pieces, with the first player always playing whichever side is on the bottom of the screen. Much like the previous strategy games we've seen on the VCS, video chess, backgammon, and 3D tic-tac-toe, Miller's computer will consider its moves by playing forward possibilities for a predetermined length of time, going between 5 and 15 seconds in the lowest difficulty to between 2 and 4 minutes at the highest. In the manual, Miller notes that while the computer component can be tough, it still had a fundamental weakness at endgame and frequently will not move in for the kill even when it has an advantage. For what it's worth, I did beat his computer opponent, whereas I certainly struggled against the video checkers opponent. And speaking of, Carol Shaw put together a pretty feature-complete version of checkers herself. Aside from the 2-player mode, her game features 9 levels of computer AI, with the first 4 being amateur-grade opposition, and 5 through 9 being professional level. Accordingly, the time her computer takes to consider its moves runs between about 1 second on the lowest difficulty, up to 15 minutes on the highest. On levels 1 through 3, the game doesn't make any attempts to consider the positions of any pieces, merely the number of them on the board, with extra weight towards kings. At levels 4 and above, the computer is taking into consideration where pieces are, how to protect the back row to prevent kings, and protecting the valuable corner spaces. And that's just for normal checkers. Her cartridge also features the giveaway rule set, where the goal is to end the game with all of your pieces either removed or blocked from moving, and these also have varying degrees of computer skill to play against. Shaw's cart features the ability to set up the board how you want using the left difficulty switch, as seen in Atari's previous strategy games, while the right difficulty switch will swap sides. This includes in the middle of a game, so you can effectively force the computer to play itself. Finally, Shaw programmed in the standard checkers notation for the board to allow people to set up specific scenarios seen in checkers strategy books. Carol Shaw donated her papers to the Strong Museum of Play in 2017, and these include some of her design notes for video checkers. Unfortunately, reproductions for publication aren't allowed, but I can at least talk about what's on them. Aside from graphical design sheets and papers denoting the move tree lookup that her game uses, Shaw's papers include her notes of putting video checkers up against Mattel's Intellivision game, the Checkers Challengers standalone games, and the Video Brain version of the game in April and May of that year, wherein she noted that the only time the Video Checkers computer lost at level 5 was against the Video Brain game on difficulty C. In all other instances, her game would either force a draw or win, despite a glitch in the decision tree that would force her game to make random moves, which she fixed before the game was finalized. A memo dated June 24th has Shaw pitting video checkers against Miller's Activision game. She notes here that his game is smaller and has fewer features, and putting Miller's game up against hers at his level 3 difficulty and her level 5, Shaw's game ended up winning. Dropping her game difficulty down to level 4 allowed Miller's game to be victorious, while pitting Miller's level 1 computer against hers at level 2 resulted in a tie game. This would be Shaw's final solo VCS game at Atari. She would assist other developers with their displays, notably Super Breakout and the Othello game that was published in 1981, but then left the company in video games entirely for a while following what she called a mini-bust period in 1980 to work at Tandem Computing Systems. She'd returned to games in 1982 after being headhunted by Alan Miller himself, but that's a story for another day. Alan Miller, meanwhile, was just getting started at Activision, and in our chronology has quite a few more hits up his sleeves. Finding reviews for VCS Checkers games is surprisingly tricky given the similar names and the fact that Checkers isn't exactly Excitement City, but Video Magazine's review of the first 4 Activision games did look at Miller's version and noted that the computer opponent could provide a good tussle for players, even if it was weak in the endgame. There doesn't appear to be much coverage of the games beyond that point, and it is unclear how well either of them did on the market at their debuts with the information available. Though at the least, on the collector market, Activision Checkers is the rarer game, according to Atari Age's Rarity Guide. Atari Corp sold a little over 33,000 copies of Video Checkers between 1986 and 1988, making it the most successful of Atari's strategy games in that time. It sold more than double what Backgammon did in the same time period, about 9,000 more copies than 3D Tic-Tac-Toe, and it was far, far removed from the whole 106 new copies of Video Chess that sold in those years. So in that regard, Video Checkers seemed to have a healthier time on the market longer than its peers, possibly owing to how relatively approachable Checkers is compared to those other titles. And interestingly, this is basically the end of the line for Checkers games on home consoles for a good while. While you can find Checkers and Drafts games for computers going forward, and eventually on handheld platforms, as far as I'm aware, no other home game console put forth their own version beyond what we've talked about here through the 1980s. This isn't terribly surprising in some ways. While Checkers is a game of strategy, it doesn't have the same prestige as chess programs do. And in any event, home consoles were proving even then to be an awkward fit for classic strategy games in general. A home computer version would have access to more game program space and more memory to provide a stronger challenge. In the future, handheld games can provide a greater amount of portability for places that you can't bring a cheap checker set, leaving home consoles to just be kind of an awkward place to play the game. But if you're into computer checkers, the VCS has 2 perfectly sound takes on it, and while Carol Shaw's game may provide a stronger challenge to good players, you really can't go wrong either way. Next time, it's Pac-Man before Pac-Man.